We are thrilled to welcome the Common Ground Speaker Series back to the JCC and to welcome all of you here tonight. The idea that the JCC is a common ground in which to explore and learn about different viewpoints is very much in line with what we consider to be our mission as a community center and a hub for growth and development of all kinds. So really, we are delighted to be hosting this event again. Tonight's discussion promises to be a thought-provoking one, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John and just thank you again for being here.
Thank you, very much. I'm John Landrum. I'm a co-founder of the Neutral Ground. Will other co-founding board members who are here tonight please stand up quickly? Or slowly if you're old. Thank you. Well done. Very good. So, the purpose of the Neutral Ground is to re-inject civility into our public discourse. And you're here because you're committed to civility in public discourse or because you're misinformed. So, thank you for the laugh. It's interesting, when we think about civility, most of us, we think about the other guys, right? So if only those guys that disagree with us would approach things more maturely, right? But who we control, who we can influence is really only ourselves. So this is really up to us. How many of us, if we think about it, can say, are we consistently objective? Are we consistently seeking to understand opposing viewpoints, even if we still disagree? Now, doing that is hard work, right? It's also, let's be frank, it's boring. You know, if you say, you don't get adrenaline from listening to some person and trying to understand, but it's boring in the way that oxygen is boring. You know, when you're out of it, it's suddenly not boring at all. And that's kind of where we are right now, right? So we're trying to tackle this and we're trying to make civil discourse boring again because it's so commonplace. I want to thank our host, the Jewish Community Center. They're great hosts. This is our second time here. They always treat us beautifully. Rachel and Rebecca and all the rest of you, thank you. I want to thank the Times-Picayune, New Orleans Advocate, NOLA.com. Renee, you're here somewhere. Renee Sanchez, thank you very much, co-sponsor. WWL-TV, I don't think Todd Smith is here tonight, but they're recording, and just a friendly reminder that we are recording. Yeah, careful.
Changes everything.
Jeez.
I also want to thank Karen Kearney. These are all just, good ideas unless somebody is like the straw that stirs the drink and puts these together. That's Karen Kearney. Thank you, Karen. Would you please stand up? Finally, quick note, in your seats are question forms. Please use those to frame any questions you may want to present, and volunteers will collect those at a certain point later on. And you can mark, do you want your question to go to the panel or to a particular panelist? So that's your choice. And then final thanks to our moderator, Natalie Simon, who is also a co-founding board member, and she's special counsel to the CEO at Latrim and is director of governmental affairs at Latrim. Thank you, Natalie. And,
Hi, everyone. So we are here to talk about a really exciting topic. And I think by all accounts, and Renee's newspaper has told us, that we are experiencing what some would call an economic renaissance, a once-in-a-lifetime transformation opportunity. This is what LED has stated. This is what we've all read about. This administration has been particularly aggressive in incentive programs and reforms, and Louisiana has recently secured several wins. I'm not going to name all of them right now, and I'm sure Michael will have a slew of them to talk to us about. One we've all read about, obviously, is the Venture Global, LNG. I'm sorry? They are investing $18 billion in an expansion in Plaquemines Parish. Another is the one we've all also read about, the Meta AI Data Center. It is considered one of the biggest economic development wins in the state's history. $10 billion in Richland Parish. I think the town has 20,000 people. And we've also read about the Hyundai steel mill, $6 billion in Ascension Parish. It's the first of its kind in the U.S. for Hyundai. And then a few days ago, Secretary of LED, Susan Bourgeois, said that 58 announced projects could lead to 70,000 new jobs in Louisiana, and that would lend us credibility in the state with future investors. All sound great, right? More jobs, more economic activity in a lot of poor regions of the state. But as the title and the invite to today's presentation indicate, not everyone's happy. But today, we welcome three panelists.
Bumper sticker on my car.
But today we welcome three panelists, all of whom are friends, and one new friend, with very distinct views on these incentives. Each of these panelists is committed to the Neutral Grounds vision of healthy discourse, and I've personally witnessed this, all model behaviors that reinforce mutual respect and trust. And with that, I'll introduce you. Michael Hecht, he is someone you all know. He's the president and CEO of GNO Inc., the regional economic development group focused on growth and innovation in the region, in the 12-parish region, I should say. We also have Stacy Roussel, who's the deputy director of Invest Louisiana. Some of you may know her organization under its prior name, which is the Budget Project. This is a think tank which advocates for strategic investments in people and communities. And then to my immediate right is Daniel Erspommer, who is the CEO of the Pelican Institute. It is the only free enterprise think tank in Louisiana. They champion free markets and limited government. I should probably tell the audience that I am a board member of the Pelican Institute, but I think
Only softball.
Daniel will be the first person to tell you that I am.
This debate is rigged.
I am very capable of asking him tough and annoying questions, so I will be an equal opportunity questioner. So I welcome all the panelists, and so let's begin because we've got a lot to cover. Obviously, this is an exciting policy area, but it's also complex. I think that we all read about these cool, exciting companies coming to town, and we get excited about the potential. I don't think a lot of us think about what this means to us as taxpayers, and I don't think that most of us, like me, understand this policy area. We are not tax experts, and we're not economic development experts. So Michael, I guess let's start with you because you are our sole true economic development expert on this panel. I think it's good for you to give us a short primer or a level set, if you will, for the discussion today. You know, what is the purpose of economic development incentives? You know, what is there? Is it to attract new business? Is it to attract new sectors that we just don't have in Louisiana? Is it to inject new business in these poor regions? And I really want to know who this benefits. Is this a win-win for all?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Well, we need a primer.
But incentives, I think, tend to fall into two categories generally. One category is stimulative, so this would be an incentive that you're putting in place to try to create a new industry or a new behavior. So example of that could be like a digital media incentive that we have. We have one of the best in North America, 25% cash back for doing programming in Louisiana. That's to create a digital media industry that didn't exist before. Another example of trying to kind of create new behavior is the angel investor tax credit, which gives you a tax rebate if you invest in a qualified startup company. So those are stimulative incentives. And then you have ones that are kind of compensatory or cost of doing business. The ITEP incentive, which is one that gives industrial companies a tax break, is one that we kind of have to do because other states do them. And so if you don't do them, then you tend to have negative points when you're competing. But let me just, I'll say two more things and I'll stop, incentives are inherently compensatory. If your, writers can write that down, if your business conditions are attractive enough for, if your conditions overall are attractive enough for businesses and families, because the best definition of economic development, I think, is creating the conditions where businesses want to risk their capital and people want to raise their families. If you do that well enough, people are actually willing to pay a tax for being there, with the two best examples being California, the Bay Area specifically, or New York City, where there's such a density of capital and talent and institutions and companies that people are willing to pay ridiculous amounts in taxes and rents to be there. So incentives are inherently compensatory. We have to just say that. And then I'll end with this. I think there's a three-part test for a good incentive. The first is that it needs to pass the if not but for test, meaning that it has to actually change behavior. An incentive that doesn't change behavior is basically wasted money because the company was going to do it anyway. The second is it has to be NPV, net present value positive, meaning that from a fiscal standpoint, from actually a legal standpoint, constitutionally, that money that is spent has to have a positive return to the state over time. And the third is it has to be permanent, meaning that if the incentive goes away, the industry or the company stays. And the challenge in all this is that the first two are basically impossible to measure. It's impossible to measure if not but for, because you're trying to measure a negative. And truly holistically measuring NPV or the ROI is a spreadsheet exercise, and I'll tell you whatever you want. There's lies, damn lies in Excel. So to some degree, I go back to, was it the Supreme Court Justice, Spencer Spotter, who was it? The one who was doing the ruling on pornography. Yeah, he said basically, yeah, you know it when you see it. And that is frustrating to those of us that like a little bit more exactitude in our policies.
Okay. Stacy, what do you think about this three-part test, and is that your three-part test? I would imagine not.
Well, I didn't know there'd be a three-part test, so I wasn't prepared for that. But first of all, it's wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate you all coming out on a Wednesday night to talk about tax incentives with some very nerdy friends.
Yes.
So it's a pleasure to be here.
This is like Jewish Mensa Club. It's great.
So as Natalie said, my organization used to be called the Louisiana Budget Project, and so we like to say budget was our middle name. And that's really the lens that we come at a lot of these discussions and debates. So organizationally, our lens is also low and moderate income households, which if any of you are familiar with our wonderful United Way in Louisiana, you know about the ALICE measure. That's our asset limited, income constrained, employed residents in Louisiana. And unfortunately, there's too many of them. So about 51% of the state really struggles to make ends meet. And that's inclusive of the about 20% that live below the federal poverty level. So when Louisiana Budget Project Invest in Louisiana comes to the table, what we're looking at is, are we maximizing as a state all that we can for our low and moderate income households? And what I love about what Michael said is that absolutely, if you get that right, economic development takes care of itself. So from our perspective, as we look at the state budget, because a lot of this is about investments, right? The question is, how are we spending the dollars that we have as a state? How are we raising them, which we might get into later, I don't know. But how do we spend them? And so as I look around the room, I know that there are some folks in here who have worked very hard to ensure that we're investing in early care and education. But I can tell you that there are kids that are in that low income that still need a seat at the table. I can also tell you that when it comes to higher ed, we are a state that went from the student putting in about 1/3 and the state putting in 2/3 to reversing that and making it so that the state is paying about 1/3 and the kids and families are paying 2/3, and that's upside down. I can also say that over the past several years, we haven't given teachers a raise in K-12. We've given them a stipend. So we have a lot of areas in the state where we really feel like you have to prioritize investment in order to get where we want to be as a state. Natalie, does that give you what you're looking?
Yeah, I think it gives me a high-level understanding about where you're going to be coming with regard to these incentives and the lens by which you look at them. Daniel, I cannot wait to ask you this question because you obviously run a free enterprise think tank. Free market folks do not mince words when they come to these types of incentives. For example, the Cato Institute, and I think the chair is sitting in our audience, calls these types of government subsidies corporate welfare. They fuel corruption. They undermine public trust in government. They promote, my favorite term, crony capitalism. They have become a vehicle for waste, corruption. They're distorted. They're wasteful. They lack transparency. They lack accountability. And they fuel political favoritism. I continue to believe libertarians have fun parties and they have the best vocabulary. So, Daniel,
Your response.
what is your ideological position with regard to these incentives?
Yeah, that's a lot to live up to. You've handed me the microphone? This is
Civil discourse at its best.
Yeah, again, the Pelican Institute, our objective is that every person in Louisiana should have the opportunity to flourish. So that's the lens through which we view these kinds of policy questions, is what are the policy conditions in the state or in the country that best allow for everyone to have that opportunity. And we come at that obviously from a free market, as Natalie said, free enterprise point of view, and sometimes especially in modern sort of political alignment, free enterprise and economic development sometimes get mashed together. That sounds to some like pro-business. And certainly we love business. That's great. That's, entrepreneurs and jobs and all that is exactly what drives success and opportunity for everyone. The challenge with incentives like this is that it does put government in the position of picking winners and losers. And so by definition, an incentive is given to one company, one industry, one group of companies, whatever it may be, and some political body makes that decision. Some government entity or quasi-government entity makes that decision. And just if we look throughout the history of the country, government hasn't tended to be all that good at things like that. And the truth is, if this worked really well, if this were the real driver of economic prosperity, Louisiana would be among the more prosperous states in the country. The Constitution, which is a whole other civil discourse conversation, but the Constitution not only is the second longest Constitution in the country, not only is it, we would argue, bloated and sort of cements in the Huey Long system of government, and that meant that everyone had to come to Baton Rouge to kiss the ring. And so the net result of that is if you are a company that has a good lawyer and a good lobbyist and a good accountant, you can do pretty well in Louisiana. And we'll get, I know, when we get sort of into broader tax policy, a lot of these, to Michael's point, are trying to right a wrong, trying to correct for broadly bad tax policy. And it's very logical. If you're an industry, if you're a company, that your job is not to try to solve the rest of the state, you're trying to create the best business environment for you to succeed. Well, the problem is we've ended up with this patchwork quilt of tax policies that means, again, the government has chosen winners and losers, and we make it very difficult, particularly for new entrants into the market, for entrepreneurs. And we've seen it in stark relief over the last 5 years as we've seen more companies, Michael may know the numbers offhand, but more companies move from one state to another, and more people move from one state to another. We live in among the most mobile periods of time in the world's history. And where have those been going? The sad answer is not Louisiana. They've been going to Texas and Tennessee and Florida, and others, and we can observe what those policies look like, and why they tend to be more successful, even though we have robust, aggressive, expensive incentive and corporate welfare programs, essentially. So I know we'll get into that. I actually don't disagree with Michael's three-part test. The challenge is, I think to the extent we can measure those things, and I'll just throw out one quick stat. There was a study that showed that, and again, I agree, it's hard to quantify, but they looked backward to say, okay, of companies who took advantages across the country, of companies that took advantage of economic development incentives, the but-for test, somewhere between 75 and 98% of them, depending on the survey, said we would have done this anyway. There was a company here that took advantage of a tax incentive in Louisiana that moved from Orleans Parish to Jefferson Parish. Well, that's not creating net new opportunities or net new jobs and that was a state taxpayer incentive, right? So the challenge is, I think most of these are bad. And the ones that are good are hard to identify. And the fact of the matter is, and I'll close with this, from a philosophical point of view, and the data bear this out, that free markets and free enterprise make better opportunity and make better decisions than a government bureaucrat. And that's fundamentally I think, a big part of the divide, as well as some of the broader tax policy.
Thank you. And I will get into the patchwork issue later, but I do think it's important to talk about these incentives first, and then we'll put a pin in that for now. But Daniel, you mentioned we are not a prosperous state, and I think that's not questionable at this point. But if you look at some of these projects, they sound promising. Meta, 500 permanent workers, 1,000 indirect jobs, 5,000 temporary workers. The Hyundai one, I think 1,300 jobs are expected with an average salary of $95,000 a year. Venture Global expecting to create 8,000 jobs or more. But as we said earlier, we'll get into what types of jobs later, because I know that is a different, an area of tension among you three. But as we said before, it's all, some of this is at the cost of the taxpayers. Our good friend, Danny McCormick, was quoted in the paper as saying, when you give these large companies these tax breaks, it puts an undue burden on the working class and small business owners of the state. They have to fund the $445 million, and he was talking about the Hyundai plant. How does that benefit a small business owner, working class people? There was an op-ed in the paper the other day. A young woman was asking these exact same questions, saying, just think of the ways our taxpayer funds could be reinvested here at home, creating jobs. And it goes on and on. So I guess my question is, what is the ROI on these? And Michael, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Stacy and Daniel.
Yeah, so.
Excuse me. I'm not familiar with, well, I figured out, return on
Investment.
Oh,
Comes across as jargon, and I see a large, I'm not well educated in knowing, I lost you. It took me like.
I apologize.
To figure out the ROI, and I expect there are going to be a lot of things that.
Yeah, we don't really know what we're talking about, so we're going to basically try to use as many acronyms and just put it in the air.
And imagine how I feel. I've been asked to moderate a panel, and this is not my expert area either. But Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give you I'll try to give you the basic way.
Definition.
Yeah. Forget ROI. Let's talk about something even more technical but more important, which is net present value, because that's really the way to do it, right? So that means that if I'm going to pay $100 to Daniel's company because he has the best lawyers, as he was talking about before, and so he gets $100, right? So that was $100 that I spent. Then if the state treasury, because the state gave him the $100, if the state treasury, gets back $10 a year in the first year, and that goes on for another 20 years, right? And then it diminishes over time, right? You don't just add up all of those years to see what the state got, because the further away you get into the future, you have to discount it by some agreed upon rate. It'd be 4 or 5% to account for the fact that there's inflation, that a bird in the hand is better than one in the future. So there's a discount rate. So basically, you get that $100 that I paid Daniel company today because it was crony capitalism, and he is my best crony. He's not a good capitalist, but he's a great crony. And then you add up all those cash flows into the future with some discount rate, and whichever one is higher lets you know whether it was worth it, right? So if I paid him 100, but my net present value is 130, then yeah, then we made $30 as a state. So that's NPV. But you can imagine making that calculation is, you know, again, it's I can tell you whatever you want if you give me a spreadsheet and a cup of coffee. So I get back to the problem is that we're going to all violently agree. We're going to start using the gloves to punch ourselves, because if we had, for example, the tax structure of Texas, where we didn't have a baked-in homestead exemption, right, which basically eviscerates our property tax base, then we could have what Texas has with no income tax and property taxes that are big taxes but are funded locally, or create local there. It's local control, which we all agree, right, Jay? Local control is better. That goes to schools and police, right? And then we get all of these fake taxes that people don't see, and we'd be more attractive. But anybody here go and try to campaign for office and say, first thing we're going to do is get rid of homestead exemption, because trust me, it's going to be better, right? So part of what we're going to disagree on is not what we want to get to, which is population growth and generalized prosperity and economic mobility, and basically maximizing the potential of our population. It's how do you do it and what's the timing? You know, we're trying to make a better gumbo, and you're talking about fixing the roux. You're talking about just leave it on the stove, and I'm talking about putting in a little spice.
Thank you for explaining economic development math. But I do think there is that big elephant in the room, and I think we should just talk about the tax code, because I think that the problem is, the true tension is that most of these folks at this table believe that this is just a patchwork approach to a bigger problem, probably what some would consider a politically impossible problem. But I think Daniel would disagree with that, given the wins he's had over the past couple of years. But let's talk about that for a minute. And one point of disagreement, while they may all agree that the problem is the tax code, the biggest disagreement is what to do about it. So why don't we start with Stacy, then Daniel, and then we'll close with Michael.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I love gumbo, I love spice, all of that, so that's beautiful. And I appreciate getting the first word, because I think y'all had the last word last year. So I'm gonna tell you our perspective, and I'm gonna share numbers that, you know, for us, really kind of paint a picture and tell a story. But I know you're gonna have your own numbers too, and your own story to tell, and it's gonna be very different. So in Louisiana, what I want to share with you is that we have the 10th most regressive tax structure in the nation, according to our friends at the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, which is a national think tank that crunches all of these numbers and looks at the combination of state and local tax, right? And so what does that mean? It means that those who are making the least, so those who are making $18,000 or below in Louisiana, are paying about 13.1% of that income in combined state and local tax. The big driver is the sales tax. And it's the sales tax at both the state, which is now 5%, and local. So I don't know, when y'all go to the grocery, I know for me, there's always a little bit of that, ooh, you know, it's 10%, which is the highest in the nation. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, to our top 1% of earners, those are folks pulling down about $500,000 a year. They're paying about 5.6% of their income in combined state and local tax. And the burden of the sales tax for those higher income earners is down to like 1%. So really, from our perspective, the way that you raise revenue matters just as much as how you spend the revenue. So we were, you know, I think we all agree, we live here, we're raising families here, that we want Louisiana to be a place that our kids want to stay, right? And, you know, I was born and raised in New Orleans, proud to be here, proud to have my friends here as well. But I wanted to be a state where my son, right, can be really proud of the investments that we're making as a state, and he can have a really prosperous future. So we made a lot of changes in the tax code, a lot of things that, you know, from our perspective at Invest in Louisiana, what we want to do is have a tax code that asks, I think, a reasonable amount for those with the most and ensures that those with the least have enough, or we're doing what we can to help them get by. Let me say, in Louisiana, we do some things right. So when we talk about sales taxes, our groceries are exempt from that state sales tax. That's a good thing, because groceries are something we all need, right? We also do a good job at having a state earned income tax credit. That's a little bit of cash in low-income family pockets once a year when those taxes, the tax rebates come in. It's a great thing that we in Louisiana have that. It's 5% of the federal credit, so it's very modest, it's very small. We'd like to see that increase, but we have some good things we'd like to see us build on that. Now, one area, and I'll be quiet and hand it over to my friend here. We're gonna really disagree about income tax. From our perspective, having a progressive income tax that asks a little bit more the more you make is really what's fair and makes the most sense. I know our friends on the other side of the aisle are gonna tell you something else. I'll let them represent their own ideas on that. But Louisiana made some changes, which in my perspective went in the wrong direction. And I'll also say that by shifting our revenue mix and relying more on sales tax than we do on income tax, we're also setting ourselves up for some potential issues down the road. So we like to take the long view. We like to look at where are we now, but also what's coming down the road, and do we have what we need to invest as a state in our people. All right, with that, I'll let my friends talk about.
Daniel?
Thank you. This is fun. Stacy and I've done this a couple of times now, and we always get to have a good time with each other. So getting to the core of the tax code, our baseline belief is that the best tax policy is low, flat, and broad, right? That everyone has some skin in the game, that it is, that everyone pays essentially the same rate based on their decisions, and that it is as uncomplicated and simple as possible. And so historically, Louisiana has had one of the most complex tax codes in the country. You got a flavor of it. We were talking about the corporate incentive piece of this. And I'll just give a couple of examples. One, we talked about the Constitution a minute ago. The section, let me first start by saying the U.S. Constitution, all of its amendments, is about 7,500 words. The section of the state constitution that deals with fiscal matters, taxes and spending, is about 13,000 words. So to give you that is twice the entire American experiment just in setting fiscal policy, and much of that has to deal with, Michael talked about the homestead exemption and other exemptions that are contained in the state constitution. Well, the fact is we don't have a state constitution. We have a very long set of laws that we give constitutional authority. Right. And that makes it very hard for the state truly to operate. So if you get to the tax code, again, very complicated, a graduated income tax rate, and appreciate the observations of fairness and certainly understand where Stacy's coming from and her organization. The fact of the matter, though, if you look at the data, states that follow the low, flat, and broad have the best economic outcomes. If you look at the states in the top 15 states in the country that are growing the fastest, that create the most opportunity for everyone, almost all of them have either no state income tax or a low, flat state income tax. So the good news is, from our perspective, in the fall, the legislature took a big swing at fundamental tax reform. We've flattened both the personal and corporate income tax. We have removed much of the complexity. They are now at least reviewing all of the different incentives and tax credit programs. Another comparison I like, so the tax code has about 432 pages of tax exemptions. So if you pick up, it's this nobody prints it out anymore, but you pick up this book and it's the tax exemption budget is about 432 pages. So that's a massive number. That's a massive amount of complexity. And I suspect one of the things that Michael will tell you from talking to businesses, I certainly hear it all the time, is that simplicity and predictability matter almost as much, in some cases more, as even what the tax rate is. And Louisiana has a history of unpredictability. We swing wildly. We have this sort of deeply populist mindset that isn't focused on a core set of philosophical principles, but rather sort of, if you think about the Huey Long populism, right? His stated mission was take from Standard Oil and make every man a millionaire. So, the idea today of every man a millionaire is absurd. Certainly it was absurd in the 1920s. And not incoincidentally, the last time Louisiana grew faster than the rest of the country was the 1920 census. And so we look just demonstrably at every step of the way, the decisions and the structure of we have existed with the kind of tax code that has complexity and has that progressivism built into the rates. And we have failed to keep up certainly with our surrounding states. And the result is, many of our kids and grandkids have had to move, have had to go elsewhere or choose to go elsewhere where there are more jobs and more opportunity. We look at this, again, think about incentives, right? Incentives matter in tax policy. The more you tax something, the less of it you get. And so the more we tax income, guess what? The less income we get. And the only truly fair tax, I would argue, and Stacey obviously disagrees aggressively on this, and this is why discourse and debate is good, but is something that everyone pays based on their decisions, especially in Louisiana because we have exempted prescription drugs and groceries and services, one of a handful of states that has no sales tax on services. So because we have a relatively focused number of things for which we choose to tax, that means that really that core tax base in terms of the sales tax is based on your consumption decisions. People with higher incomes significantly spend more money, they buy more things, and they pay dramatically more taxes. So if we want to get to that question, again, this is a question of opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost for me for these sorts of tax incentives and credits and special carve-outs is that that's money that could be reduced in taxes so that more money goes to economic investment and job creation. Not to speak for her, but I suspect what Stacey might say is the trade-off there is less money to spend on government services, whether they're roads or bridges or education or social welfare programs. You obviously correct me if you disagree with that.
We could rename this common ground in addition to neutral ground, because we do have some common ground in simplifying, right? We do have some common ground in let's make a system that works. Now, clearly we have different views, which is why we're here. That's how we got here, right? A different perspective and maybe see in the numbers different solutions, different stories, right? And I also wanted to note that we are taxing some services now, right? That was part of the changes that we did.
Like 3 additional ones.
Right.
I
Okay,
think.
that's all.
The ones that didn't have the good lobbyists.
Yeah.
So,
It's exactly right. It started with the Secretary of Treasury had proposed, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 new services to tax at the same rate in order to lower.
Bless his heart.
Yeah, Richard.
That's off record.
And so but if you've ever spent any time in that Capitol, you see the massive number of lobbyists, and there's nothing inherently wrong with lobbyists, but the ones who had good lobbyists got immediately taken out of the bill, and ultimately it became politically, it wasn't worth the trade-off to tax some. So I think we added some streaming services and, basically places where there wasn't parity. If you bought, I don't know if anybody buys DVDs anymore, but if you bought a DVD, you'd have to pay a sales tax on that. But if you are streaming or paying a streaming service, you didn't have to before. So those were the only ones that actually ended up in the bill.
I do want to move on because but Michael, I do want to ask you one question though, because it sounds like Daniel's saying, and I think Stacey as well, although you guys have very different solutions, they're saying simplify the tax code, that's the real problem, business will come, no more need for economic development, and you guys are basically getting Michael out of a job?
Yeah, so here's my economic development formation story. Yeah. No, I'm very employable. If you're doing a wedding, bar mitzvah, I know a great DJ, reasonable rates. One of my first trips I took was to Charlotte. This was about 16 years ago. Charlotte was booming. Then it continues to boom. And I was meeting with the Charlotte Regional Chamber, and I was able to have lunch with the chairman of the Charlotte Regional Chamber. He's a man who just passed away, Humpy Wheeler. Anybody here know who Humpy Wheeler is? Yes. Humpy Wheeler was one of the most famous names in NASCAR. He managed the racetrack there. He drove around in a gold Rolls Royce. He wore cowboy boots, and in my mind, he had a big 18 or whatever it means, a big galleon cowboy hat. And we went to lunch at the top of the B of A Tower, overlooking the concrete wasteland that is Charlotte. And I said to him, Humpy, what's it like doing economic development in Charlotte? And in my mind, he had his boots up on the table next to my cream spinach. I don't think that's true, but in my mind, that was the
It's the
scene.
Excel spreadsheet.
Yes, in my mind. And he said, Michael, doing economic development in Charlotte's like running a laundromat. We just open our doors every day, people bring us their money. And yes, that was what economic development would look like if we got the conditions right. I would be we'd have a different job. We'd be managing growth problems, like Austin is doing a poor job of right now, or like Nashville is going to need to be doing soon. Ultimately, again, let me get back to, I don't think that true economic development is just about marketing. It's not just about, Allison used to work with us, it's not just about the Chardonnay and cheese cube circuit, right? True economic development is about creating these conditions where businesses want to invest, people want to raise their children. And if you do that, it means that economic development is broadly relevant and it never, ever goes away.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time talking about these differences in tax policy, and Karen just reminded me we don't have much time left. But given what Michael just said, I think both Pelican and Lobby, which is the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, they've written extensively about Louisiana's population loss, our ranking in various categories, bottom 10 for overall tax competitiveness, 50th in social mobility, 49th in lawsuit climate. We're the 10th most regulated state, as Daniel mentioned earlier. And we've got hurricanes. So it's fair to say, while we have a lot to offer, it's not easy. And to quote Sheryl Crow, this ain't no disco.
What?
So.
How did Sheryl Crow get here?
Well, you're the DJ. You're the DJ, Michael. But I guess my question is, are these incentives enough to keep these businesses here long term? And I guess this is a sustainability question. Daniel, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, I would say demonstrably not. If they were, we would be in a much better position than we are today. And, I want to hit a real quick thing. I know we're running out of time, and I want everyone to have a chance to talk. You said in listing those big economic development wins, these are expected to create X number of jobs, expected to create this much investment. Well, you go back and compare the announced expected to the actuals, they almost never hit those expectations. They sound, I wish they would. But the fact is, it's rare.
Probably divide by 50 or more.
Yeah, it's not good. And so, they don't meet those expectations. There's a study recently that showed that in Louisiana, I think it was the time frame was over the last decade or maybe 15 years, basically taxpayers have spent $60,000 per job created through economic development. Well, it's not great. I think, arguably, and there's a lot of other things, whether we want to spend it on social welfare programs or give it back to taxpayers, obviously a broad thing, but that's $60,000 a job is a lot of money.
I'd like to see your work. I'd like to see that math, but that's a different.
Well, Michael, are there consequences for people not fulfilling?
Yeah, so look, the best incentives, the way they're structured now are all on a rebate basis. So you perform the task and then you get your money back. So there's no need for clawbacks anymore because everything is paid on a performance basis. What I'd like to do before I have time is I have on my note card some examples of good incentives and some examples of bad incentives. I'd love to go through that to illustrate, I don't know if it's now or last word or
Perfect, but why don't we do that now? One incentive you guys all agree that's bad is the film tax credit, but it's still on our books for whatever reason.
Well,
But go ahead.
Yeah, so let's talk about good first, and we'll get to bad. So, good incentives have to pass at least most of those three tests, right? The if not but for, the positive ROI, NPV, and the permanence. So, digital media incentive, I believe that over time it's going to be positive NPV. You look at the slow but steady growth we're having, companies like Capado, DACA, High Voltage Software, DXC, which interestingly absolutely did not make the 2,000 mark that we talked about, but is employing 300 people in Louisiana. That's greater than zero, right? So there is so digital media, I think, will pass the positive NPV test. I know that Jude agrees with me violently on that. Historic tax credit. If the historic tax credit for rebuilding did not exist, we would not have a downtown post-Katrina, and most whole historic downtowns in this country would not exist. It is a stimulative incentive that jumpstarts the market, creates those buildings, which are now condos and offices and entertainment centers, that become revenue producing for the state and for the federal government ultimately. So that one passes the if not but for test. The British Airways incentive, we worked for 3 years with two governors to bring British Airways here. We had to give an incentive to them. It ended up totaling $9 million. That British Airways flight is one of their most successful flights. It's down now because they couldn't get enough planes from Boeing, different issue. But that incentive went away 2 or 3 years ago. We talked to them. That flight is here. I mean, who knows about the future, but they didn't leave when the incentive dropped. And then the newest incentive I want to talk about, and I think that you're going to like this too. We used to have you're going to like this, we used to have something called the Quality Jobs Incentive, where if you had jobs above, and it was not a particularly high mark, it was like $70,000, you got 6% back. It was about quantity. What Governor Landry and Susan Bourgeois, Secretary Bourgeois, said is, we want quality. So the new program, which is called the High Impact Job Programs.
HIP.
Yep.
HIP.
Wow. No, it's actually, yeah, wow.
That's what I've been calling it.
I love that. Okay, I love that for you.
Thank you.
Is the HIP program, So Hip It Hurts, is that if you create a job that is 125% of the local prevailing wage, so you're doing above average, then you get an 18% incentive. If it is 150%, so basically half more of the local wage, so if the local wage in your community is $40,000, you have a $60,000 job, you get a 22% incentive. So there we're trying to get the average wage rate up, because the problem in Louisiana is not just quantity of jobs, it's quality of jobs. Okay.
Michael, can I ask a clarification on that program, because it is a new program?
Yeah.
When you say you get a 22% incentive, it is the state providing
Correct.
the company a grant, right?
No, not a grant, but a rebate. So you have the jobs. The details, leave that to the economic
They're
developers.
using the term grant on their website.
Okay, I would not, well, it's a reimbursable grant. So you perform, then you get the money from the
Back.
state after you've had the
Got
job
it.
for 3 years or whatever it is. So it's a grant in the sense that you don't have to repay it, and it's free money, but it is after you've performed, and the math for the state works out NPV, ROI positive. Bad incentives we love to hate. The one that I want to talk about that's less known is, do you guys remember the enterprise zone incentive? Anybody in building will remember that. That was a big thing that came out that was going to incentivize all this development in distressed neighborhoods. The reality is that it didn't pass the if not but for test. The things that you got in terms of your property tax break, your sales tax break, was not enough to fundamentally change behavior. And I always tell people that developers are neither good nor bad. They're amoral, right? Basically, if a project is going to give a return to the investors and to the bank, they'll build it, and if not, they won't. This one failed that test. The film incentive, my personal belief is that it probably is ROI neutral to the state. I think it's a wealth redistribution program. It took money from the general treasury and gave it to the people in the film industry, and it was fixed so that most of them are in the state. So I don't necessarily believe it was that wealth destroying, but maybe it was just moving the eggs around the plate. The real problem is that this industry has wheels, right? It's super easy to get extorted by an industry with wheels because just ask Atlanta, right? And so what it creates is an incentive for a race to the bottom. And my personal belief is that there is an inherent wisdom to economic development. Places have a raison d'etre. Ours, I believe, is energy and trade, right? That's why we were founded. And I think a lot of the film will end up back in LA, because that's why LA was created.
Michael, we have not heard from Stacy yet, and I know Karen is eager to get to audience questions, but Stacy, we have not, Michael did not mention the industrial tax exemption program.
Oh, yeah.
ITEP, for those of you who do not know. So why don't you, what is your perspective on that?
gonna have to rebut
And
this.
explain, I know, but explain, I think all of you guys want to rebut this, but this is the industrial tax exemption program. And Stacy will do a much better job explaining what it does than I do, but high level. It provides companies that invest in Louisiana a property tax rebate for 10 years. Stacy, you take it, and then we'll go. I know Michael is itching to respond already, and then we'll end with Daniel.
All right, okay, well, I'll just start with the neutral part, which is what it is and how it works and how it's changed really over the past decade. So, and I'll kind of talk about it from how it's changed a little bit. So there's a few key components to this. So the industrial tax exemption, ITEP, as folks call it, right, takes local property tax revenue, right, and allows companies to not have to pay that local tax revenue if they get this exemption for a period of years. And it was previously set at 100%. That changed under the previous administration to 80%. So right off the bat, companies started paying that 20% of the property tax, and that didn't have a big effect, which might suggest that 100% was too generous. The way that it's structured is that you have an unelected state board that gets to grant this exemption. So under the previous administration, under John Bell's administration, locals then were given an opportunity to weigh in, right? Because that was their money that was being given away. And it's their money to pay teachers, to work on roads, to do that community investment that's so critical. So then we created an opportunity for at least locals to weigh in. And the way they structured that was to make sure that those who were going to be foregoing the revenue had an opportunity to say if they wanted to or not. The decision still rests at the state, but the locals had an opportunity to deliberate. And community members could show up at the school board meeting where it was on the agenda and talk about how they felt about it and what they wanted to see happen. That has changed somewhat under the Landry administration, the consolidation of how that input happens. Instead of having each of the separate meetings, there's now a one council meeting. And I do know that my good friend is going to call it the one stop, which does make it sound much more streamlined and beneficial. But I would suggest to you that there's also a benefit in having it on the agenda at the city council and the school district and the folks who are going to be most impacted. So all of that, we still have some mechanism for local input. We still have the reduction from 100% of that revenue being given to the businesses to 80% instead of 100%. But one big thing did change recently, which was the requirement to create jobs. And so we still have a very lucrative, very generous program called ITEP that no longer has the job creation requirement. And that, I think from the perspective of giving away tax dollars, we really need to think about how are we impacting community? Because you're right, I love the idea of quality
jobs, not to reference the old program that
was
wasn't
awkward.
doing a good job, right? But we
That's our
do
nickname.
agree on that. That's right, it's hip.
Yeah.
It's hip. But what I would suggest is that the changes that were recently made to ITEP make it harder to justify and to say we are creating good jobs, because really, folks, businesses can come in and they can automate. And we're all for businesses having, doing what businesses do, right? Being productive. But I think the question is, should the state reward that decrease in job creation with a tax incentive? So that's how I would describe ITEP, but my friends might have some other perspectives on it.
Michael, why don't you talk about the job requirement? Because in addition to the local pivoting to state control, the job requirement's gotten some
Yeah.
attention. So why did that change?
I mean, the truth is that the only thing I would disagree with what Stacy said in terms of her critiques is that I do think that it's very important if you're a company and you have to get local approval, which makes sense because it's local dollars. Going to a single body is far easier and drastically reduces not just time, but even the possibilities of corruption, because there are fewer people that might get to you around the bend and say, hey, how are you going to make this work for me? And I also think there's a misalignment in incentives. If I'm a school board member, I am not elected and I am not incented to create jobs. It has nothing to do with nothing directly to do with my job performance. And so I'm going to be against this, prima facie. It just doesn't make sense. I'm going to be a short-term school board member. So I like the one-stop, although some people would describe hell as a one-stop. But I do think that the issues of local control and the concerns about job creation, which is our job, are valid concerns.
Thanks. Daniel, I know you were also pushing for local control for years, so what's your take?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. By the way, I think if you have questions, now's the time to pass them in. I'll be quick.
Karen
we'll
and
get to those.
John are getting
Karen
them.
and John are collecting. So from a policy perspective, philosophical perspective, I agree. It makes sense for, it's local tax dollars. They ought to be, those decisions ought to largely be at the local level. However, as Michael pointed out, the very practical problem of this, if I'm elected to the school board, I'm thinking about teachers and curriculum and buildings, and my biggest job as a school board member is to hire and fire the superintendent for my district. If, I'm just making this up, but if ExxonMobil comes and plops a $1 billion plant refinery expansion in front of me, I have no idea what I'm looking at. And it makes it very challenging to get good outcomes. But the real problem is the program itself. Now, I think Michael may have mentioned this earlier, this idea, I forget which words you use, but I call it the arms race. Part of the problem with these incentives is if other states are doing it, it's very hard just to end yours, right?
It's a prisoner's dilemma. You'd be a fool to
Absolutely.
end yours, right?
And so, that's where sort of practicality meets philosophy, and we have pushed to take these as a holistic thing. So if a bill came up tomorrow that said end ITEP and nothing else changed, we would probably oppose that. However, we think ITEP is a program that, if you look at its history, and this is oversimplified, but the core pieces come back to that homestead exemption. When, especially 40 years ago, 50 years ago, most parishes didn't have an average home value above $75,000. And so in many parishes, especially the rural parishes, the only taxpayers at the local level, really, or only property taxpayers, were businesses. And so if you're a business, right, every time the parish council or whatever wants to build a new park or pass a millage increase, yeah, everybody's voting yes on that. They're not paying for it, right? Or not directly paying for it. We can get into why corporate taxes are bad later. But, they're not directly paying for it. And so I think ITEP was a rational response to that problem, which says, hey, if you want us to be the primary property taxpayers, you have to give us some reason to want to expand. Otherwise, we're going to, talk about the portability thing. You can't pick up and move an oil refinery, but you sure as heck can decide not to expand it, right? Or you can move your stuff elsewhere. So, I think we have to deal with the practicality of the arms race, and I think look at how to phase those programs out while we dramatically improve the climate to where that's not necessary. You know, politically, I think this is where you're getting at, Natalie, removing the homestead exemption is just, it's a non-starter. It's been a non-starter for the last 100 and some odd years. Politically, political candidates have, been shot into oblivion by suggesting it.
Stop returning your calls.
Yeah.
We've got a ton of questions, not a ton, we've got several questions.
We'll be rapid
But
fire.
I do want to thank all of you. Obviously, I want to go back to the mission of the neutral ground. Clearly, the purpose here was not for you guys to leave here and be economic development, tax policy experts. But I do think that I want to thank the panelists. I think it was Leonardo da Vinci that said that you can't hate or love anything unless it's first understood. And I can tell you guys came prepared. You understood each other's perspectives even right out of the bat, and I really appreciate you guys exemplifying trust and respect. Let me get to the questions. This is going to be fun for the Tulane fans in the audience. Are you in favor of eliminating Tulane University's property tax exemptions?
Yeah, I'll go. As a Tulane. So yeah, I'll talk about the broader issue. This actually came up quite a bit in the debate in tax reform this fall in the legislature. We have a very broad exemption for nonprofit organizations, which includes hospitals and
Churches.
Schools, universities. And by the way, it not only includes the hospital, but it includes, for example, the coffee shop on the Ochsner campus, or whatever it may be.
Now he's rolling.
So, from a pure tax policy perspective, we would say, again, does it pass the low, flat, and broad answer? No, it does not. Now, again, that would be a major change tomorrow. And so that also doesn't make a lot of sense to all of a sudden say you had it, now you have nothing. But if we can move to a place where we are more rationally making changes that don't just have dramatic negative impact, but get us back to a place and closer to a place of low, flat, and broad, because the other problem is we keep passing new exemptions. The biggest chunk of that section of the Constitution is the homestead exemption. And it seems like every time I walk into the ballot box, there's something else asking me to exempt some other group of people from property tax. So we've got to, I would argue, I would not say we remove that today. And in fact, that became a point of contention in the ballot box on Amendment 2 last time around, as many churches felt like they were losing their property tax exemption. They weren't. That is still protected, would have still been protected in the Constitution.
They have good
today.
lobbyists?
Well, the churches unfortunately don't, but that's right. But what that was doing was try to move that into statute out of the Constitution, so at least there was a chance to try to reform that.
I've got an idea for Daniel. But first of all, I think that what low, flat, and broad, it sounds like a Neanderthal's brow. I feel like that should be like your new slogan, or
I didn't think that the word Neanderthal would be
Tonight.
said tonight, but
Yeah.
go ahead.
You could do a mascot. You could get one of those outfits. I do believe that once the automatic meters go into effect in the city and people begin to get reliable water bills over time, come on, Mark, don't look at me with that squinty look. It's possible. It's already, and trust is rebuilt in the Sewer and Water Board, that we do need to very seriously consider a drainage usage fee that is paid for by every organization, that happens to get rained on, which includes Tulane, which includes Ochsner, and which includes the church.
Thanks, Michael. Stacy, do you want to comment, or?
I'm going to pass.
Good. Well, actually, the second question relates to some of the stuff you guys have been talking about before, obviously. We live in a poor state and region. How do you sell taxpayers on spending money on incentives versus basic services when basic services of government are not functioning, especially when some incentives are for universities that do not pay tax property?
you want?
I mean,
I would just say very, very simply, I think most of these decisions don't reach the level of citizen engagement. So there's not a lot of selling that goes on to the public on these. These are almost exclusively decisions that are made in the confines of the state capitol building. And so, especially in a political playing field that has lots of big hot button issues. So rarely do voters get to weigh in on that. Rarely, you're not seeing the, matching color T-shirts with signs at the Capitol talking about tax incentives, right? That would be interesting. But so I don't think there's a lot of salesmanship that goes on. But if you poll this stuff, and we've done some of this, obviously with all polling, it depends on how you ask the question and that sort of thing. But they're not nearly as popular as, for example, fixing the roads or getting the drainage to work or whatever that may be. So, but it's a hard question to answer because you rarely get to that level of public discourse about these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a chicken and egg, and of course, if you don't have companies and jobs, it's hard to have nice things. But people want nice things, and they don't trust government, and they don't trust companies, and they don't trust anything except what they're reading on their algorithmic feed. So it is indeed a challenge to have long-term economic policy in a low trust, low information, low truth democracy. Have a nice day.
Stacy, do you want to add anything, or?
I would like to say a word in defense of the safety net in Louisiana. So we've talked about some highs and some lows for the states, and I want to just share there are some things we do really, really well when it comes to making a safety net that does work. There's some things that we don't do well, but Louisiana has one of the lowest uninsured rates in the nation, and that's because we expanded Medicaid. And those are public dollars that go into private healthcare providers, private health insurance companies. And what we get in return is that when people are sick, they get to go to the doctor. And that's a great thing. And so Louisiana has done an excellent job in covering our citizens through Medicaid. There are threats coming down the road, especially with some of the changes that have been recently enacted at the federal level. I'm sure you're all very aware of the government shutdown and the immediate potential hit to SNAP. So folks who are in desperate need of being able to go to the grocery and feed themselves and their families are at risk. But I'll say a little further down the road, the federal government has elected to require states to share some of the burden of SNAP, which they've never done before. So as you were talking about being at the Capitol, we're talking about budget projections for years out. We need to be aware that the state is going to be on the hook for $50, $100 million to support these federal programs. And I'll tell you, in Louisiana, these programs are critical to local economies. They're critical to local grocery stores where people spend those benefits. So I do want to just say we're doing some things right, and it's really important that the safety net remains strong and we have enough money to keep it running in the out years.
John, can we have another civil discourse discussion on the safety net Medicaid?
I was going to say that requires its own, actually, entire 3-day seminar. But I do want to thank you guys again, and thank you for the audience members. And John, thanks for inviting us.
How about that paddle? What they just did is not easy, right? First of all, it takes a lot of intelligence just to voice what they voice. It also, frankly, takes courage to come up there and be civil, and it's kind of an exposure. It's kind of a trust, and so thank you for doing that. Don't you just want to take them home?
Wait, can I say one thing? I meant to say this. So speaking of the internet, I was called on the internet this week the most dangerously stupid man in Louisiana. And I thought, don't print that. And I was like, wow, that is
Michael, I think you planted that so you could get out of work. How about that moderator? That was not easy. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody. Good night.
Good night.